Good everybody, welcome to another episode of Bosses of Knowledge. And this episode is just going to be me because Tane has got to go do some training, so which is all good. So you get to hear my voice and my guest voice as well. And as always, when we start our podcast, we like to talk about what we've put into our Bosses of Knowledge over the last few weeks that we've had a chat. I think the biggest thing that I put into my Bosses of Knowledge is the to be adaptable and be flexible because basically, as we've seen over the last few days and last few weeks here in New Zealand, we have had an increase in Omicron spreading. We've seen the protests in Wellington. We've seen the weather changing, and it's quite easy to stop and go, "Oh, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that," or to take sides without actually understanding anyone's perspective. And I think the biggest learning for me has just been just not to put a certain lens on one point of view, but actually to change my lens and look at different points of view because everyone has a point of view and there's no right or wrong. And then we might come to that in today's podcast. As always, our listeners, the purpose of this podcast is to talk about student journeys and people's journeys as they've gone through life, because there's expectations out there for you to know what you want to do, and what we want to try and do with this podcast is to show you that actually that's all those expectations can disappear overnight, and that's okay. And to talk about that today, we have, as always, another fantastic guest. I have been really privileged to know this young man for a very long time. It is my honor and my privilege to welcome Casey Davies Bell onto our podcast. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. We have been friends for a number of years now, so thank you for having me.
No, thank you. It's a privilege. Casey, so I know you as well as I do. Do you want to tell our guests, our listeners, who you are, where you're from and what do you do, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, sure thing. So originally born in New Plymouth, now living in Wellington, I've found my passion in community building, where I run a technology startup focused on community building. So it's a virtual event platform which allows networking. We're currently going through some interesting growth opportunities, working through an accelerator. We were just talking about this before we jumped on. But in the essence of it, helping people find belonging through community.
And that's such a powerful thing, because in today's world, lots of us are individualistic. We look at ourselves and forget that actually we live in a community, and the community is where we thrive, and our community helps us thrive. But also technology is part of our lives, and how do we use that to actually build our communities, which is pretty an awesome space for you to work in. But before you did this year, let's talk about where it all started. Let's talk about where we first crossed paths a long time ago. That makes me sound old, but a while ago. You were at Spotswood High School in the Taranaki when we first crossed paths. And tell us about, at that point in time, what was happening in your world, because you were head boy at the school at that time. There you were looking to go to university or to tertiary, and that year was a pretty challenging year for you in a lot of ways. I mean, there's good and bad points in that. What should we go back and speak about that? What happened in that year?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess this would be 2012. Yeah. So 10 years ago now. Yeah. Time certainly flies. And as you mentioned, at that point, I'd become the head boy of the school of New Plymouth, of Spotswood College in New Plymouth. And that was quite a significant thing for me, because just being kind of authentic right off the bat. Before that, I'd actually spent a bit of time in Dunedin, where schooling hadn't actually gone that well for me, if I'm going to be honest. I had a bunch of, I guess my peer group was some older kids, sort of thing, and it kind of led to me not going to school a lot, not really taking it seriously, that sort of thing, where I think I probably actually had the lowest attendance record out of my entire school at that time in Dunedin. Oh, wow. And when I went to New Plymouth, I moved up and lived with my dad, and it was an opportunity for me to take myself more seriously and give it my best shot, and that's what I did. And going to New Plymouth the first year, so I joined in year 11, and in the first year my goal was attendance, because I had something horrific like a 30% attendance record beforehand. Yeah. We're talking to the point that I previously had a truancy officer that gave up on me. It was that bad. Yeah. When I went to New Plymouth and started going to Spotswood College, my goal was attendance, and I got 100% attendance.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't miss a day. In fact, I remember, you wouldn't do this now because of COVID, but I remember a day that I was actually quite sick, and I insisted. My dad was like, "No, you can stay at home. You're like genuinely not looking good." And I'm like, I want to go to school because I was making a point for myself. Apologies to any friends if I made you sick. Hopefully I didn't. You definitely wouldn't do that now. But anyway, it was a point to myself. And then
can I ask you a question quickly? I don't know if you can remember this, but what was your shift in your mindset to go from, hey, at school, Dunedin, didn't bother going to school, and you moved to Plymouth? Was it the change of scenery, or was it something within yourself that actually drove there? What was your drive, if you can remember that?
Yeah, probably like many things, there's like multiple factors that can play to it. I do think that I was 16 at the time, and I knew I wanted to make an impact on the world, even when I wasn't going to school much in Dunedin, but my environment was not very conducive of that. So any kind of efforts I made to put myself in that frame of mind was significantly outweighed by other things that were happening. Yeah. So I think that foundation was really important. But to be honest, I also think it was the right time for me to go and live with my dad. I was kind of going through, I guess, adolescence and kind of discovering myself and all that sort of jazz. And having a bit more kind of like structure, I think, was what I needed at the time. Yeah. There was that. And to be honest, I also just think Spotswood College is such an amazing place where I was able to be my authentic self. I was welcomed in both by the school staff and students with open arms, and not judged for my past. So I think all those things lined up, where I then was able to just like see opportunities and be encouraged to take them. So for example, when I first started going, I remember there was like getting on, like just putting my hand up to get involved in different kind of extracurricular activities or having a say in different things. It was just like so encouraged and refreshing that I knew it was my opportunity to change my narrative. But I do think it came intrinsically, because when I say that my experience wasn't the best in Dunedin, I have many friends that were going to the school I was going to that did exceptionally well. And so it's not a reflection on the school. I think the thing that actually happens is your intrinsic motivation. There are external motivations that can influence your narrative, but the self narrative you tell yourself is so powerful.
And that's true. I think as we've spoken on our last few podcasts, it's your self talk. And your self-talk can either make you or break you. And sometimes you don't realize that. In fact, lots of us don't realize that until something good or bad happens and you actually, where does this actually come from? So that's really, it's really awesome, your awareness at the age of 16, given where you've come from to this, there's that intrinsic motivator is really powerful for you to do that.
Yeah, and you're so right as well in regards to like, that influences your actions. Like a super quick anecdote, so without trying to derail us too much, but for anyone that's listening, think of if you've got a car, think of what sort of car you've got, and then think to yourself, how often do you see that car around when you're driving around or whatever? You probably see it a lot. I bet you I probably don't see that car very often unless we've got the same type of car. And the whole point to that is that in your mind, you take more notice of the things that are important to you or the beliefs that you have. So for me, I drive a Mazda Verissa, so I see them around all the time. It's not that I'm exposed to Mazda Verissas more than other people, but for me, it's just something I notice now. And I think the same can be true with our beliefs, which is if you believe in yourself and you're wanting to do a particular thing or pursue something, you're going to be more consciously aware of when opportunities present themselves in front of you because you're looking for it in the first place. So I think a positive narrative and having clarity on what you're trying to at least discover, even if it's just like broadly in the direction of something you're trying to discover, you'll unlock more opportunities by having clarity around that.
That's so true. And there's a phrase I like to use when I'm working with young people. It's where your mind goes, your energy flows, or something like that. Because as you said in your analogy, when you start seeing these things, you're going to see it all the time, even though they've always been there. It's always been there, but you just don't notice it because your energy is elsewhere, and it's really important, like you say, with those beliefs.
Totally. Another quick example is if you're snowboarding or skiing, you don't look at the tree. You look at the gap because that's to your point. That's where you'll end up. Yeah. So I guess that was the pivotal thing, is I had some intrinsic motivational change that happened. I was then fortunate enough that I had an environment that was supportive of whatever direction that looked like. So yeah, I got heavily involved. Attendance record became flawless, which for me in itself was just like such a big accomplishment.
Yeah.
And then I transitioned in year 12 to wanting to focus on academics. And I was, through a lot of support from different teachers and also friends that were quite driven, managed to get endorsed with excellence for level 2, which for me was just like a crazy goal. Which I mean, I actually had I was getting to the point where we're approaching end of year externals, essentially for endorsed with excellence. I don't know if it's changed much, but you had to have 50 credits of that level and above at excellence. And I remember getting close to externals and not wanting to just rely on externals, because that's there's more pressure that comes with that. Ideally, you want to get it from externals, but you want to kind of have it close in the bag before you go into externals. And I remember even, I didn't study history at the time, but I convinced the history teacher, who was a fantastic teacher, to let me get involved in history as a subject and do different assignments and expand my knowledge and my capabilities in that subject. But also it allowed me to kind of further bolster some of my credits as well. So I get quite competitive. I think I've got a bit of an A-type personality that maybe sits in there. But nonetheless, I took that seriously and managed to do that. And then I was very lucky in being able to put my name forward and get the support both of the students and the staff to become head boy for 2012.
Yeah, and I think for our listeners out there, this is an important thing, because Boston College is the only co-ed school in Taranaki, which so it's quite a different school within the region in terms of what they offer. And like I said before, it offers a whole lot of different things for different people. Not to say that different schools don't, but also the fact that your history teacher actually let you do that. A lot of other schools will be like, my subject, you can't do this. So it's a testament to both you and your teacher to let you do that. So that's awesome. So you were now award head boy or head student, head boy. I think it's head boy. There was head boy, right? Yeah. And that was an interesting year for you. And I'll let you tell the story.
Yeah, I mean, it was a transformational year with genuinely the highest highs and the lowest lows of my life. Yeah. I guess starting with the highest highs, being in that position where, also probably worth noting that at the time before I'd become head boy, I was so nervous at public speaking. Like I remember having like an English assignment where I had to like deliver a monologue in front of the class, and I was shaking like a leaf. Oh, wow. And there was only like 15, 20 students in the class. That to then with head boy every assembly, myself and head girl Anna Hinton, who's a good friend and an incredible person, would have to address the whole school. And we're talking close to, I forget the exact number, but it wouldn't have been that far off 1,000 students. Yeah. So it was quite transformational in just putting yourself into a position of being uncomfortable, but where growth was happening, and being receptive to feedback. I think that's such an underrated skill. And if there's like one superpower I think people can embrace, it is being open-minded to feedback, whether it's delivered in a positive way or even just as a direct critique. I think it's always an opportunity that you can become better, which is such a gift. And I think it can take a real art, because sometimes the way people can deliver feedback can be hard to reconcile, because sometimes people, to be honest, some people are shit at giving feedback. If I'm just going to be blunt, they say it in a way that can just feel offensive. But no matter if you can embrace the ability to be almost agnostic to the delivery of someone else's feedback and look at the substance of what they're saying, and is there something there that you can take on board to become a better person? If you do that, it's just incredible what happens in your life. And that was like a focus point that I had, was trying to improve in different things. So there's the public speaking side of things. There was also just a lot of different leadership related activities, as you can imagine, balancing that with also not dropping the ball on academics and all that sort of stuff. So, and also I just felt very blessed in my friend group. Spotswood College was a very open and welcoming community where I felt that the year 13 group that I was part of, it felt like we were one giant family. It honestly did. So it was a very positive experience in that. And I'm trying to think, where where in the year would you have come? Because it would have been.
Well, we crossed paths first in about April or May. That's when we first crossed paths. And I just, for our listeners,
Gotcha.
I'm gonna put some context here for this. So Casey says he was nervous, but when I met him, he was one of the most confident people I've ever met in my life, and which is why I just gelled at that time. In my job, I meet a lot of people, and people stand out. And I still remember you asking your questions with confidence and not being afraid to say, "Hey, why? What about this and what about that?" And that still stands out to me today, 10 years later. Just for some context, so I met you first in I think April or May of that year there.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. I definitely started gaining a lot of confidence in the public speaking piece. I started off super nervous, but I guess like anything, if you just like embrace the uncomfortableness and look for areas of improvement and practice. It's like with any craft, the more you do it, the more confident you become. I think sometimes I internalize things where I feel more nervous than I let on. Because I definitely still get nervous.
which is a human trait, right? I've always, one of my mentors told me it's good to get nervous. When you get nervous, that means you're afraid to mess it up, which means you have some passion in it. Whereas if you're just ambivalent about it, you're like, I don't actually care what's going to happen. Then you're doing it for the wrong reason. So for those of you that are out there that are still nervous, it's okay to be nervous.
Totally normal.
It's okay to be nervous. Yeah, it's okay. And also, I think the big thing that you said is it's okay to it's good to try, fail, but also to listen to feedback. Feedback is probably the greatest gift that we have out there. And I think a lot of us, and myself included, we don't do anything because we're afraid of the feedback. But we're not afraid of the actual feedback. We're afraid of the tone that we're going to be getting. Because the same message can be told to you in two different ways. And when someone tells you the same message in a very nice way, you go, cool, awesome. But the same message tone with an aggressive or a negative mindset, those are the things that you fear, and we just don't want to do anything about it. So I think that's an important training for anyone out there. Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great nugget there. In our first 20 minutes, this is fantastic.
And I'd say that it strikes both ways, both in your ability to receive feedback, trying to be agnostic to the way it's delivered and focusing on the substance, but also hold in mind, if you give somebody feedback, how can you deliver it in a way that isn't going to feel like an attack, and the message of what you're actually trying to convey, which most people, I'd be bold in saying, comes from a place of love and good intent on just wanting to help the person, right?
100%.
But how do you frame it in a way that it's going to be better received by the person that you're talking to? And that takes practice. It also sometimes like personality types totally comes into play. There's all sorts of nuances to that, but it's definitely something that I think about a lot, especially now as I'm building a team with my startup. It's a very important thing.
Yeah, and that's very true. And we can keep going to that there, but I want to swing into the lowest of the lows in that year that happened to you as well. So here you're, Casey, you're thriving in this community. You've been given this amazing responsibility, and you're taking that head on. And then life becomes unkind, a little bit unkind, if that's a nice way to put it.
It sure does. And on particular, the date would be the 8th of the 8th of August, 2012, where I lost my best friend. Alongside there was a number of people, 3 lives that were lost. There was a tragedy that happened where it was the Topek tragedy, where there was a school activity for Spotswood College, a PE trip for the year 13 group, where they were going to go, I believe, water rafting. But it's actually a bit of an ironic start. They were going to go water rafting, and there was a group of, I don't think it was a very big group of call it, say, 12 students. My numbers here might be slightly off, but about 12 students. And the instructor only had the approval, if you will, to have, say, 11 of those students under his watch. And there was one too many. So from a safety perspective, they made the call that as a group, one of two things had to happen. Either one student couldn't participate in the water rafting, or they had to change activity. And they decided as a group that, well, we don't want anyone to have to sit out, so let's change activity. And what that resulted in is the decision to climb around Paratutu in New Plymouth. For those that aren't familiar with New Plymouth, Paratutu Rock, it sits on the waterfront of Back Beach. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, and it's the top of a dormant volcano that it's the Sugarloaf Islands, which actually used to be the top of a volcano a long time ago. And they were rock climbing around it. But what happened was, because it was a last minute decision, they didn't check the weather. And it was some of the biggest swells that were coming in for a very, very long time that New Plymouth had ever seen. And by the time that the swells really started kicking in, they were already committed to climbing around it. And there was a particular kind of part to it as you're climbing around the waterfront, where it's a number of meters up off the water, and you're meant to be able to just walk across without having clipped on with a carabiner, because it's not anticipated that there'd be waves there.
Yep.
And then when you get further along and you get closer to the water, then you clip on with a carabiner. Because the waves got so big, the students actually had to run between sets of waves. And there was this particular part that happened with, I had many close friends at Spotswood College. I was fortunate to have friends that close, but there were two in particular where we were a trio, Stephen Getty and Campbell Shaw. And we just would do everything together. Every day after school would be at the beach or playing basketball or just getting up to mischief, just loving life. And I wasn't on this trip. But the way I understand it is that Stephen and Campbell were at the front of the class and the first in line to run around this corner where they had to go between the waves and clip on. And it was a blind corner, so you couldn't actually see what was happening. And Stephen turned to the class and said, "YOLO," which means you only live once. And then they both ran around the corner and a wave came and Campbell was able to clip on, but Stephen wasn't able to clip on in time and he was washed off the rocks. At this point, the class doesn't really know what's happening. And Johannes and Felipe, two international students that were also close friends within our year group, they ran around the corner. And same deal where Johannes was able to clip on, but Felipe wasn't. And Felipe got washed and dragged into the water. By now, the class realizes what's happening. And the instructor, Bryce, jumped in the water in a futile attempt to look for them. Stephen was never seen again to this day. Bryce was never seen again to this day. And Felipe washed up a number of weeks later. And it fucking broke myself and many people within our year group. So it was the 8th of the 8th, 2012. Pretty rough.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I remember that story at that time, and I remember coming to see you a few weeks after that, and I could just see your shoulders. You were a different person. You're a very different person, and you can imagine why that would be. And this would have been tough for you because this was, as you said, your best friend, and you had to also hold the mantle of being a head boy at school at that time. How did that go for you?
I actually think it was one of the things that helped me get through it. I felt that by being the head boy, it was my responsibility to, as you say, be the rock for the year group. So I did my best to shoulder that. And I think through the process of trying to be there for others, it was actually in a weird way actually being there for myself. That me helping others grieve helped me grieve. I definitely, I'm not one to normally cry, but I vividly remember it was particularly around when you would see a friend that mutually we knew Stephen. I wasn't blessed to know Felipe very well. But Stephen, I was with every day, like not exaggerating, just like every day would be either playing Xbox or shooting hoops or just at the beach. Like every day we'd go to the beach after school and would be together. So it was very, very close friends. And what would always particularly break me would be when we saw a mutual friend, whether it was a teacher or a friend from our year group or someone that I hadn't seen since it had happened. And then you'd see them for the first time since it had happened and you just looked at each other and it just brought all the emotion back. And I made an effort of trying to touch base and see how everyone was doing. So it was a very emotionally charged time period, but I honestly feel that trying to be there for other people, to what extent I was successful at that, I think we all banded together. So I don't think I was particularly special at being a rock, but I think the process of trying to help others really helped me. And I mean, even things like of course, like the news picked it up, as of course it would happen. And I just even remember vividly moments of like, at Back Beach, there's the sand dune, the Back Beach sand dune, massive sand dune that goes to the base of Paratutu in the Sugarloaf Islands. And I remember being there with, I don't know, half a dozen to a dozen close friends that were all grieving, and a reporter showed up, just trying to ask question after question after question and figure out what was the reporter knew that we were the friend group sort of thing and asking questions. And to be fair to the reporter, just actually trying to do their job and trying to understand what was happening. But I remember I'm usually quite a patient person, but I remember getting quite assertive in that situation and telling him to leave and give us space to grieve. So there was different types of leadership I had to step up into in regard to also helping protect people's boundaries.
Totally.
Because it's such a sensitive thing. Or even things like, as a group, as our Year 13 group, we wanted to walk down along the coast, looking for our friends, and having to call that off and convince. I was largely one that had instigated it, but then in reflection and guidance of some close teachers, that the last thing that we wanted to do was put a whole lot of emotionally unstable friends on the in potentially dangerous way if the tides for whatever reason was, and I'm sure we would have been fine on how we navigated it, but it's like still not a situation we wanted to put ourselves in. And so then like being torn between kind of like, nah, screw that, I want to find my friend, to also being like, well, no, let's actually look out for everyone and look after the safety of everyone. So there's like different nuances of leadership as well as like personal grief that was happening. But yeah, it was a challenging period. I now have a tattoo of an S on my back for Stephen, and it's got an infinity loop at the base of it. It's a dragon on my back in the shape of an S. So I carry Stephen with me every day. There are particular songs that trigger our friendship memories, and all that sort of good stuff. I'm still close with his family. The Getty family are an incredible group of people that I see as my family. So I try my best to visit when I'm up. I'm not up to New Plymouth as much as I used to be, as I'd like to be, but New Plymouth is a special place for me because it was when I, like, kind of reflecting on the start of the conversation, it's where I turned a new leaf. I went from being a bit of a drop kick, not going to school much, having potential but not really doing much with my life, to really trying to excel in different areas of leadership and both from attendance to academics to actual leadership and that sort of thing. So it's a place of reimagination for my own identity, but then it's also mixed with also my place of birth that I moved away from and moved back to, as well as like literally the highest highs of my life and the lowest lows of my life all in one place. So it's
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, it is a space that that'll hold memories no matter what the memories are, whether they're emotionally powerfully charged, or emotionally negatively charged. It is a place that is going to be special for you for so many reasons. And thank you for sharing that, because even 10 years on, I can still see the emotion and the passion that you have for your friends and what happened that time there. And I remember that vividly because I was in New Plymouth the week after this happened, and I still remember coming to the school the week after, because that's when we normally come in, and that's when I saw you. And because the other thing is, amongst all this is happening, this is a stage of your life when all the universities are now contacting you, and you have to
That's
support
right.
that. So, your plate is going to be like, hey, here I am as a young person that's lost a friend. Here I am as a head boy that's trying to do my best for my community, and my group. I'm also a son to a father who's seeing his son going through this, and now I've also got to still think about the next year, and all this is on your shoulders at that time there. So so that would have been pretty turbulent for you, but also all the expectations from intrinsically and externally that will be on your shoulders. But again, you're academically very, very successful from year 12, and all the universities are saying to you, hey, we're going to give you some money, come to us. How was that for you in one angle, you're like, oh, life is really short, and the other angle is my life is just actually starting in a way. Yeah. So how did you feel about that? If you can remember that.
Yeah, I can. And the word you use is completely correct, which is expectations. I remember also quite vividly, the narrative was not what are you doing after year 13, it was what university are you going to?
Yeah.
So there was a very strong implicit expectation on that. And to be fair, that's what I wanted to do. I did want to go to university as well. So it aligned up with my narrative of who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. But you're right, that you've got like this life so short, you've just lost someone so close to you, and truly appreciating being present, to also looking at like, we're still teenagers, like we're
Yeah.
looking at starting the next chapter of after school, what's that look like, and university and that sort of stuff. At this point, from maybe a career perspective, maybe more of an outlook on life, I definitely become increasingly passionate about, over the number of years of my life at this point, I become increasingly passionate about wanting to make a difference in the world, having like this base level of a foundational framework, which was that I genuinely believe the intent of most people is good, and that people when bad things happen, it's often good people in shit situations, but intrinsically, most people are actually good people. So holding that in mind, I've always been a believer in trying to make a difference. And then like with my experience of turning a new leaf, all that sort of stuff, what that left me landing on was I wanted to do something as a profession where I could make a difference in the lives of others. And at the time, I was torn between two different directions. One was the legal system, of getting involved in the legal system, perhaps as a lawyer, to try and fight injustices or get involved in bringing through regulations that could help people, planet side of things. And the other side was very much on looking at the environmental aspects of the world through geography and the ramifications of oil and gas and the whole narrative around that. So those are the two things that were kind of going through my mind. And where I landed on was to study both geology and law. I'd also been possibly a little bit biased in what university I wanted to go to, in that I lived in Dunedin, but also through just the positive narratives that I had from people I did know that went through Otago, just spoke so highly of it as a place that transformed them as individuals, both intellectually on what they studied, but also just as people and the experiences you go through going to Otago. So for me, while there's an expectation of uni, I'd already decided that Otago was the university that I wanted to go to, and I'm glad I did. So what that led to was,
can I just stop you there? Because I remember this really blatantly, really vividly, because you had the offer, you were coming to Otago, you had a scholarship. And I remember you called me in November or December of the year, and you said to me, "What do I do? Because I've been given a job offer to work at an oil and gas firm." And I just remember this conversation because you're like, "Now what do I do?" Because you had money in the bank coming there, and you also had this offer here. Do you remember that?
That's right.
Remember the conversation that we had?
I do remember that. So ironically, studying at Otago University with scholarships, where one of the core focuses was on geology to better understand the planet and trying to have a positive impact on the planet. And then I got this job offer to work in oil and gas, where I was going to be starting on a $90,000 salary, which like for a 19-year-old, I'm like, holy shit, that's like before tax, just under 2,000 a week.
It's like the jackpot, right? Really, it's like the jackpot at that time. Yeah,
crazy amounts. And also, like with oil and gas, it doesn't stop there. It goes up and up and up. So I was definitely in the conundrum of actually having those options in front of me. But ultimately, I decided that I wanted to take a bet on myself and what I could do within the scope of change, opposed to opportunity I had right in front of me.
Yeah. And off you came to Dunedin, and what was that like for you?
It was incredible. Like, definitely some of the fondest memories I have and the funnest memories are of Otago. So coming to Dunedin, some context there, that's where my mum lives, and I had family there as well, including my sister and some others, which I have a great relationship with. So being able to kind of come home to like my second home. My homes are kind of like New Plymouth is my place of birth, but Dunedin, I spent the most of my life growing up. So, and there was also this kind of like weird sense of coming back to an old stomping ground that I hadn't done very well in, but with a reimagined personal brand on wanting to be a role model to my peers around me that previously had gone in different directions. So there's kind of like an interesting kind of narrative happening there. But I just had a fantastic time. I was fortunate enough to get accepted into Arana College. Some may hold that against me. I remember starting university, every time you'd go out into town, there'd be funny chants for all sorts of things, depending on what the celebrations were at the time. But one of them was not pleasant towards Arana, which was more of like in fun spirit, mocking the fact that I think a lot of people wanted to get into Arana. But it was a bit of a running joke anyway. But I made some incredible friends there, and it was a very supportive place to be, very close to campus as well. So I started off with a raw, but ultimately what unfolded relatively quickly, which was the negative undercurrent, was I'd also picked up a bit of a drinking problem, if I'm going to be honest. And it was not just because Otago is a great place to have a drink, which it is. It was because I was suffering. I was still struggling from the loss of Stephen. And I mean, to be honest, New Zealand, while I think the narrative is actually changing, there is a drinking problem in New Zealand. And I was particularly good at that drinking problem. So I over-indexed on drinking before going down. And then I continued that trend in Otago more than I should have. And while I had initial success in my studies, ultimately I was unhappy and I was still broken as a person. And one of the hardest things I had to make the decision on was I felt so grateful for the scholarships and the support that I genuinely felt blessed to have. And I had to ultimately pull the pin on my study because I was suffering so much. And I wasn't ready to give it my best. Because holding in mind as well, we're talking like 4 months after this has happened.
100%.
Like this is 8th of 8th of 8th, then August, and then going into January, February, back off. So had a lot of fun in regards to just meeting wonderful people and people that were also ambitious and wanting to change the world and that sort of thing. But ultimately ended up returning to New Plymouth probably 6 months later for a little bit of time. I ended up moving in and going flatting with Campbell, so the other best friend from the trio, finding myself, and ultimately going back to university after that.
With a different focus now, right? With a different focus.
Yep, different focus. I also did some reflecting, and I came to the conclusion that the world is driven by enterprise, and it's the most powerful vehicle for change, enterprise for business. But we, the people, actually influence the success of any enterprise. The only reason any company succeeds at scale and survives is because we vote with our money and we spend money on that thing and we reinforce that. The reason there's about 39,000 McDonald's around the world is because we spend money at McDonald's. If everyone stopped spending money at McDonald's, they'd go out of business. In the same way that when a cafe pops up and everyone loves it and goes, they're humming, they do well, and sometimes they open a second cafe. But if they didn't choose the right street and they don't get a lot of foot traffic and they don't get many customers, they end up shutting down. The correlation and causation there is where the people are spending their money. Yeah. So while enterprise has this enormous impact on the world, it's ultimately where we spend our money that directly influences the success of different enterprises. And then holding that in mind, I also came to the conclusion that enterprises can be a powerful vehicle for positive change. Like there's a negative narrative quite often around enterprise, but I think it can be a very powerful one as well. And I think there are plenty of examples of where that's happening. I mean, Tesla's a great example, which has completely revolutionized the priority around EVs for all automakers. And there's plenty of examples that we can go into like that. So I became very inspired by enterprise and decided that while I was passionate about the legal system and trying to drive change through there, I felt that I could be more nimble and have personally, it would be better aligned for me to have impact by getting involved with business. So I returned to Otago University in 2014. So this is about a year after. So I started university in 2013, the first time around, and then went back to New Plymouth around halfway through that year, and then returned to Otago a year later, mid 2014, for studying international business.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, you also started to work in your own space. You started to realize actually there's some things you could do while you were studying. Is that correct? Or was that just purely, when did you start getting into the whole startup world and starting up your own little initiatives?
Yeah, so it was about 6 months after I'd started studying at Otago for international business. There was a number of kind of different factors that happened, but one of them in particular was I'd always had the mindset of, since I started studying international, I had the mindset of get my degree, and then with that, I'm going to be able to go either do an MBA or start a company or start driving change. But the first step, get my degree. But what ended up happening was about the end of that year, some people may recall that there was this thing called Gigatown, a campaign that happened around the country called Gigatown. And it was a competition for what city would be the first to get gigabit speed, a gigabyte a second speed installed for the whole city to utilize. And they would get it first for a couple of years as the pilot by a company called Chorus. I think it was owned by Arctel. It would be rolled out there first before everyone else. And there's huge advantages of having such fast internet. And Dunedin was fortunate enough through the hard work of many, many people, including people like Heidi Renata, who's an incredible human being based in Dunedin as well, that Dunedin won and got this. And part of the package of that was not just that Dunedin had high speed internet rolled out, but there was $700,000 of funding that would be given away as grants to different initiatives, 200,000 of which would be given to startups that wanted to do a venture that could utilize the benefits of fast internet. So it was to create use, like you could look at it from a business lens, it was to create case studies of amazing things that can happen if you like roll out fast internet.
Yeah. Totally.
So that was kind of like the thing that sat behind it. But 200 allocated for that, 200K allocated for that, and 500,000 allocated for community initiatives that aren't really startups, but benefit the community and again kind of utilize high-speed internet. So that got me thinking, well, let's apply for that. Let's pull together a venture that would be impactful and try to kick it off. And this was around December of 2014, coming into 2015. Long story short, we didn't get the funding. Through that process, though, I learned a lot of skills of, I recruited a team of I ended up partnering with a guy named Alex Robinson, who's still a close friend. He now lives in Brisbane. And we built out a team of maybe five or six people. I was working literally from a friend, Nigel Westbrook, working from his garage that was leaky. So like I'd come in and like my little desk that I had was just like a huge puddle of water next to where my laptop was, or like it was a pretty funny dynamic. But nonetheless, we were working from there, and we had this initiative. It's called Green Data, where we wanted to build a data center based in Dunedin, so that the ping time or the latency of using other countries' data centers was significantly reduced. It does make sense in regards to like the advantages you gain of having a data center so close or like within New Zealand at scale. But keyword scale is the part where it falls apart, because the market of New Zealand being only about 5 million strong didn't really make sense for the costs that would be required to actually set up such a data center infrastructure. And green was the fact that we authentically wanted to run this data center, which data centers are intensive on energy for those that may not be aware. And we wanted to run it on clean energy.
Yep.
So
yeah,
that's where things started kicking off. And I got involved in February 2015, there was something happening in Dunedin called Startup Weekend. I don't know if the folks listening on this are familiar with Startup Weekend, but it's essentially a weekend-long event where anyone can rock up to it, and they pitch an idea on the Friday night, or listen to ideas on Friday night if you don't want to pitch. And then you form teams on the Friday night, usually teams of like 4 to 5 people, and you get a whole lot of mentorship where you build it into a business by the end of the weekend. So you spend all of Saturday validating the idea and trying to figure out what makes sense on what you're doing, going through pivots, which is where you'll have an assumption of what you should be doing that you ultimately realize is incorrect, but then you uncover an opportunity that you didn't before understand or see, and then you kind of pivot into the different direction. You go through this kind of rapid iteration cycles, and with the guidance of mentors that have done this sort of thing, and you just learn so much, both from like a business development perspective, a design perspective. If there's someone like coding it up or building it, there's like different kind of roles that people take on. And then by the end of the Sunday night, there's a judging ceremony where they bring in successful startup founders that can hear what you've done, and then there's a whole bunch of different winners and prizes that are awarded. But holy shit, it's a transformational thing to go through. And what happened was, I wasn't aware of it. At this time, I was, as I mentioned, working from this leaky garage, which I was still grateful to have because it was a space I could work from. I was getting some light support from the city council for the initiatives that they had set up at the time.
Can I just stop you? Were you studying at this time, or did you stop studying now?
I was still studying.
Okay, cool. Yep. So just put context: studying and still working. So this is awesome. Yep, cool. And
ultimately, what ended up happening though was Nigel and Alex just seen the words Google as a sponsor on the Startup Weekend event that was happening. And they were kind enough to buy me a ticket. I didn't even know about this weekend. So they just bought me a ticket saying, hey, this Friday, this is a ticket, go to it. So I was like, okay, that looks pretty intense, but let's do it. So I pitched the whole green data idea, and then recruited a team of people to work on the idea with me throughout the weekend. And ultimately, through that, we invalidated the idea pretty quickly with the hive mentality of different mentors, some of which actually had put extensive thinking into such a proposition that we were able to unpack things quite quickly. But what we did land on is like the intent we wanted to have was a positive impact on the environment while like on having like a green data center, while making it better for businesses to be able to interact with data that they'd upload or download. But what we landed is that the actual intent we wanted to that we really cared about was having an impact on the way businesses operated and using something that came from like authentically trying to make a difference for the environment. And the common narrative we were picking up from the business owners that were mentors at this event were they cared about trying to be sustainable, but they didn't really know what that looked like in the context of their business. It was very kind of opaque and just difficult it was very intangible for a lot of them. So that's where we realized, holy shit, the people care. This kind of goes back to the axioms or beliefs I mentioned before that I think people have baseline good intention. People care, but they just don't even know what to do. They don't know what actions to take and that sort of thing. So Green Data pivoted, or more completely rebooted, into another venture, which I ended up working on that startup for about 3 years. And that startup was called GEA, which was an acronym for Global Environmental Impact Assessment, also a play on words with Gaia. And the whole business model of what we did was we had a leaderboard of businesses based on their carbon impact. And we would help businesses measure what their carbon impact was. And then we would reward consumers for shopping with the businesses that were on that leaderboard. So the idea is that as a person, you could type in cafe in Dunedin or wherever you are, and you'd see in proximity to where you're willing to go, all the cafes listed in order of carbon activity or how well they stacked up relative to their size. So you'd be like, okay, this cafe is authentically trying their best. I'm going to spend my money and support them. So it was a way to actually incentivize consumers to vote with their money to drive change in the world. And then at the same time, make it easy for businesses that authentically were trying to change to get more customers so that they'd be in a better position to succeed. So we got ultimately about 120 businesses engaging with us, over 1,000 consumers using our app. We managed to get a little bit of money behind us to do that. I was also very fortunate in that the mission that we stood for, we attracted an incredible team of volunteers, essentially, where we'd put in 60, 70, 80 hour work weeks every week trying to get this off the ground and pitching it at different competitions and just trying to get the word out there. The learnings that I gained were just phenomenal. But what ended up happening was the pressure of trying to be the founder and CEO of this like tech startup at now, I guess now I'd be 21 years old at the time, and doing university was, I was being stretched too thin.
Yep, totally.
So I made the decision to drop out of university for a second time, but benefiting nonetheless still from the support of the university in regards to faculty that I'd built relationships with and with friends and students that I'd built relationships as well with. I guess what I kind of have neglected to mention, which starts to thread into what I'm doing now, is during that time I also fell in love with community building. So in 2015, I participated in Startup Weekend, but from the next year onward, I got heavily involved in running startup weekends. And ultimately, I got involved in facilitating startup weekends across the country. There's different roles in startup weekend. There's like a participant, you go through it as a participant. There's like crew, which kind of organize and make sure food arrives. You've got the venue and the sponsorship, and there's a lot of work that sits behind the scenes on making that happen. There's mentors, which are like go around the event and help people and give expertise and ask good questions to kind of drill into what they're doing. And then you've got facilitators, which are kind of like the MCs of the event that kind of help keep everyone on track. And if there's any difficult things, they kind of handle those situations, but just give the energy to the event. It's an incredible thing to be able to be in a position to do if anyone ever does get involved in that. But I fell in love with community building through there, and both in the community building for the mentors and the participants, but also working very closely with building leaders within the crew of the organizers, because one of the things that is really tough to do is succession planning. In something like any volunteer capacity, usually there'll be leaders that have taken a lot of responsibility on and they do a phenomenal job at what they're doing. But if they leave, quite often it leaves the organization up shit creek, because it's like there's so much context and relationships and stuff that they hold. So there's a real art in kind of leaders building leaders, where you help the next kind of generation coming through to pick up the mantle before you leave. So it's a smooth transition. So I just fell in love with that space. Did that at the same time, trying to make payroll for my team at Gear, my startup, was tough. We didn't have a lot of money flowing through, but nonetheless there's still expenses of like rent and food and all life stuff, right? So
totally, that happens.
Totally. So what I ended up doing was I got my hustle on, where we also needed a space to work. Like we really wanted an office. And up to this point, I'd mentioned that I'd been working from like a leaky garage. It was through Startup Weekend I discovered the concept of co-working spaces, which at the time weren't that kind of popularized. That's right. I was like, holy shit, I can be in a building with other people creating businesses. It's so good. So there's a place called the Distiller. It's now called the Startup Space. Well, it used to be called the Startup Space. Now it's called the Distiller. And it's a university building, which is part of an organization called Startup Dunedin. It's, for those involved in going to Dunedin, living in Dunedin, or know someone in Dunedin that's involved in entrepreneurialism, Startup Dunedin is incredible, and it's comprised of the support of the university, the City Council, Otago Polytechnic, and a number of successful entrepreneurs. And they had the space, the startup space at the time that I started working from, and it was just incredible having this kind of energy and other people building things. Anyway, I really wanted an office, and I noticed that there was an office that just had a bunch of boxes in it and was doing nothing. And I convinced the community manager, Jason Beck, who's a phenomenal dude, he now lives in Auckland, convinced Jason Beck that I would take the rubbish out once a week and clean the coffee machine if I could have the office for free. And he didn't want to do those tasks. So I managed to screw us an office. And then what ended up happening was I, over time, got more and more involved in helping him with his role. He kind of taught me a lot of different things from a running an event perspective, and got heavily involved in, ultimately he left to Auckland and I stepped into the role as the community manager for Startup Dunedin, and both was running my startup as well as working closely with trying to build out the startup ecosystem for Dunedin.
Which is really, really cool. I think there's a lovely thread that flows through this whole conversation is, if you don't ask, you don't get. You know, you asked your history teacher and you did it. You asked Jason, hey, the worst you could say was no, and that didn't happen. So, you use the word hustle there, but I think it's just you getting out there and asking the question, and it goes back to feedback, right? The feedback was, yep, cool, here we go. So that's awesome. So you had these two hats on, and then you finished up with your time in Dunedin, and then you moved up to Wellington. Is that correct? Or
Yep, that's correct from a timeline perspective. I guess like wrapping up the gear thing, ultimately, while we had good intent to change the world, the business model didn't make sense. There were some technical challenges that were more systemic than stuff we could just build. So we made the hard decision to shelve it, and take the learnings forward into new ventures that we did. I then went full-time running Startup Dunedin and spent a couple of years setting up an incubator. I was very blessed to have a fellow named Angus Pawley start working for Gear, who then transitioned to working directly with me as the assistant community manager of Startup Dunedin. So we were kind of like a power team of two for a long period of time. Where we ran all sorts of different startup events and built out community and some incredible things there. And then the team started to expand, and Rachel Butler ended up joining the team, another phenomenal person. And at that intersect, my partner Hina graduated university. She'd been studying a degree in computer science with a minor in marketing, and she got a job at KPMG, which was to be based in Wellington. and she had to come up and be based here if she wanted the role. Startup Dunedin isn't really a remote role. It's like, got to be in Dunedin to run Startup Dunedin, which makes sense. So I made the decision that I would step away from that into the unknown and move up to Wellington so that Hina could take her job. So what I then did was I decided I'd start a marketing agency. I'd been experimenting with drop shipping. I don't know if anyone on the call is familiar with drop shipping, but essentially it is where you have a storefront, you have some products that you run social media ads where people can purchase your product. And if they purchase it, it orders one unit from something like AliExpress and ships it directly to them, but with the names that they entered in. And the real benefit of that model is you don't have to hold any stock or hold any risk of stock that doesn't move. The downside is that your margins suck. Like, you make nearly no money off it, especially if when you consider running ads. Because the lower the entry point on anything, the more people that are going to do it. The more people that do it, then you reach perfect competition, which actually just drives up margins. So there's that, and the other side was the delivery time of products to people wasn't very competitive relative to something like Amazon. So I cut my teeth on doing that, where I was turning over thousands of dollars worth of I was selling Galaxy duvets into the US. I don't know why, but I just there's a weird niche that I was just I wonder if this works. And it did, but margins weren't very good. But nonetheless, I ended up being fortunate enough to transfer my knowledge of digital marketing into helping companies that had established products, but they needed to get it in front of people. So I lived about a year and a half traveling the world with my laptop, where I helped different companies. I had one company in particular that was a really big company based in Melbourne, but has a number of subsidiaries or businesses underneath them that are based here in New Zealand. I run all their Google ads and Facebook ads, and I had some good success. We took one of their product offerings from about 60,000 in monthly revenue up to 180,000 in monthly revenue. So we're talking about they were happy. They got some good results from that. So I did that, traveled the world a little bit from my laptop. Went and seen Hina's got family in India, so we went through, and I went through the Golden Triangle with her and met some family there, and then ultimately came back to Wellington. But I was getting a little bit unsettled and itchy feet, because while I was enjoying the marketing from the outcomes I was getting, I wasn't passionate about it. And I wanted to get back in the startup scene. So this is probably now, we're talking probably 2019 is where I've done the whole marketing agency and traveling piece. And then this role comes up for an organization called Kiwi Landing Pad. For those that aren't familiar with Kiwi Landing Pad, probably a lot of people are familiar with Silicon Valley. So it's the epicenter for technology on the west coast of the US in California, just south of San Francisco, right next to Stanford. So essentially what happened is, during the internet boom, there was a lot of innovation that came out of Stanford. So it kind of became the place, before the internet had taken off, it became the place that if you really wanted to find talent that could work on engineering, computer engineering, that was kind of the place you found the talent.
Yeah.
And as a result, that's also where, when you're starting a startup, I'm going to try not to be too scatterbrained, because there's so many important nuances that kind of feed into why Kiwi Landing Pad, who I end up working for, is important. But essentially, when you're starting a startup, the difference, it's important to consider a definition difference between a startup versus a business that's starting up. A startup is typically a bit of a Venn diagram between innovation, momentum, and scalability. More if we just focus on the innovation and scalability. Innovation, scalability. Momentum is more of a subjective thing of moving quickly. But innovation and scalability. And usually what happens with a lot of software innovation is you'll spend enormous amounts of money in the beginning getting it right, adding value, finding something called product market fit. That's a loaded term, that there's a lot that sits behind that, but it's you spend a lot of money before you make much money. Similar kind of concept to what happened with gear, is we spend a lot of money without making a lot of money.
Yep.
Eventually, if you get it right, and most startups won't, you'll hit a hockey stick where you can start scaling this, and because the cool thing about something like software is it's really hard to get it right, but once you get it right, you can just sell it to everyone, because like your code will just work for everybody.
That's right.
It's the same code, you're just duplicating it. So what that translates to is that quite often for a startup to succeed, they need capital. They need money injected into their business that can pay these phenomenal engineers to actually build it in the first place. And they need to do this at a time where they're not making any money. And if the people that created the companies, the founders, don't have
capital,
they're not wealthy, they don't have the personal capital, which I didn't, and most founders when they first start off don't, then it's kind of like, well, how do you get around that? So that's where investors drop a whole lot of capital into these startups for a percentage of the business, and say, go for it, build your startup. So it used to be that in order to find the right talent and in order to find the capital, it was largely concentrated in Silicon Valley and up into San Francisco.
Yep.
Kiwi Landing Pad was founded by an incredible person. He's based in Maryland. His name's John Holt, where he had a successful startup, realized that he kind of had to, well, he's selling into the San Francisco. He's on a plane every week to go back and forth. His startup ended up getting acquired or bought out by a company called Cornerstone. So he had quite a financial windfall from that. And he wanted to make it easier for future founders that were in the same position that he was in, where they had to go back and forth to Silicon Valley or San Francisco. And quite often what would happen is you'd, as a Kiwi, you'd fly over to San Francisco because it's where you had to be to have these relationships. But you'd land and you'd be like, what do I do now?
Yeah.
Like, where do I go?
Yeah.
Like, do I go to a cafe and just try and cold call people?
Yep.
So Kiwi Landing Pad was one of the first co-working spaces in San Francisco. And like, as the name kind of suggests, Kiwi Landing Pad, it was the place that you went when you first landed into the US, into San Francisco, and you could connect with other entrepreneurs, usually Kiwi entrepreneurs that were trying to make their dreams come true, and grow their businesses. That became a global community of founders and entrepreneurs of about 5,000 strong. John being there from the start, there are a number of people that were involved in different roles of actually running it on a day-to-day basis. I think, though, it'd be fair to say most significantly, the person that was there for the longest, other than John, was a lady named Sian Simpson, who's an absolute world-class community builder and built it into the community of the 5,000 founders and entrepreneurs and investors. So she ended up leaving in 2019 after about 5 years of running it, and moving on to start something called Public Rally, where she now works with incredible other brands like Michelle Dickinson with Nano Girl and a bunch of others, building community. That's what she does because she's amazing at it. And at this point, I've got startup history. I'm so passionate about startups. I've been traveling the world doing this digital marketing. And the conclusion I've landed on is I want to go to San Francisco and start a startup. So at the same time that this is happening, this is kind of like June, July in 2019, I have a friend reach out and say, hey, Kiwi Landing Pad is on the quiet, looking for someone to step into the role that Sian Simpson had. So I ended up going through a number of kind of coffee interviews with John and being fortunate enough to get this role where I was going to be spending a good chunk of time in San Francisco and a good chunk of time in New Zealand and bridging the two ecosystems. This is in 2019. You know where this is going.
Yeah,
the world changed. So yeah. I was meant to actually fly out on in early 2020, I was meant to fly out on something like I think it was like a Thursday or something. I was meant to be flying out and having to cancel it on like the Wednesday night because the huge change that made the difference was I was going to something called SaaStr, which was like this giant software event where all sorts of tech leaders come, and it would have been an amazing way for me to kind of like jumpstart my network into San Francisco. But all the keynote speakers started pulling out and guests started pulling out. And then the huge change, as I remember it, is that San Francisco was declared a state of emergency, where if you came as a foreigner after the fact that they had declared that, your insurance became null and void.
Yep.
So I was like, oh, yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, it's an expensive place to get sick in America. Expensive place.
Very expensive place to get sick without insurance.
Yeah.
So that made that an easy decision. A sad one, but an easy one.
Yeah. So that was that at that point in time. And well, you still stay with Kiwi Landing Pad during the lockdown, and that would have been an interesting time for you as well.
Yeah, like it's such a it's a non-profit. It's funded by a number of people. Originally kicked off with John and Sam Morgan, who founded TradeMe. Supported by, in the early days, even Peter Thiel, who was co-founder with Elon Musk, with PayPal, and now Palantir he runs. He's no longer involved, but was involved in the early days. And then still to this day, it's supported by a number of incredible organizations, including Stephen Tyndall. So Stephen Tyndall, I think people throughout organizations like New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, Amazon Web Services, BNZ, Jasmine Enterprise, I believe it's called. There's a number of supporters that have just like understood the benefit of creating community around founders that are trying to build great businesses. So in the early days, some extra context is like Kiwi Landing Pad helped house things like Xero, like when they were first in like trying to get up and running in San Francisco, or Vend with Vaughan Ferguson. Companies that like Xero is worth more than $20 billion now, then exited, got bought out for about 500 million. Like some of the original sort of New Zealand success stories, there's a relationship where Kiwi Landing Pad played a small role, but nonetheless an important role in being like that launch pad in a place you could be in San Francisco. And what it ended up doing though, through the leadership of Sean, is it turned into more than just a co-working space. It became a community. Yeah. So then when I took on the mantle in 2019 coming into 2020, even though I could no longer get to San Francisco, the community was still
there. Yeah, vibrant.
Yeah. So then my role became about how do you engage and activate and support a thriving community when it's all online. Yeah. So I'm still involved with, so Kiwi Landing Pad has now been rebranded to Territory 3. And I'm still involved with Territory 3 to this day. It's now run by my successor, Lilia Alexander, who's a phenomenal person. I don't know if you know Wellington Live, the Facebook page, which has had enormous success. So she started that and recently sold it, and is involved with a number of different kind of influencer marketing campaigns and that sort of thing. But she's now accepting the role as community builder for Territory 3, but I'm involved as a founder in residence. So I'm now running my own new venture, but I'm involved with connecting different founders and supporting people involved.
Oh, this is awesome. I mean, we could keep talking for a very long time, and it's almost 1.5 hours. But I just want to bring it home very, very succinctly, I guess. One of the key things that I've noticed in this whole conversation is that it's always come back to community, and your intrinsic appeal to help people. From the time that you came back to New Plymouth, you were with the wrong people at the time at Dunedin, but you came back, you shifted a little bit, and you were like, cool, I need to make the first step, which is actually I've just got to go to school and get 100%. And I just need to go to school. That's all I do. Then you found your calling to help people. And then, you did some stuff while you were at school. You built a community at school. You had some very close friends. You went through the highest of the highs, the lowest of the lowest, and all the time you had community. You came to Dunedin. You realized that this is awesome, a great place. And again, you met a lot of amazing people. But again, you had self-awareness to go, actually, this is not the right place to make this right time, because I was going through my thing. And again, your community got you through, and you found your community because you went back home, you lived with your best friend, and then you started your ventures. And, the key thing, I mean, there's some amazing things you've done, and, I'm just brushing this over very lightly. But for me, the key thing that I've seen too is the people that have been around you the whole time, and your growth to actually make the world a better place through whatever it was, because the one thing that you said to me when you're doing the digital marketing, you made money, but you could see it was no passion in you. This was just you doing it just because it was a means to an end. And even when you're speaking, you're like, okay, cool, I did it, that's all cool, made a bit of money, but when you went back to speak about your Kiwi landing pad, a whole change in your vibrancy just changed. So I think what's important for listeners out there is that everyone here knows intrinsically what their values are, and when things are not when you're not vibing, you should trust that non-vibe and go, right, cool, hey, what actually makes you vibe, and go back to that. I know that's a very quick summary of all the awesome stuff you said to me, but that's what comes out to me as I listen to your story. Which I think is pretty amazing, and I'm very lucky to have met you a few times during this time here. And I still remember when I met you in Wellington when you moved up for your job, and how excited you were to start off at Kiwi Landing Pad, which is fantastic. Like I said, we could keep talking, but that'll be. I think we'll put our listeners to sleep at the moment, because we like to keep things on for an hour or so, but. You've shared tons and tons and tons of nuggets through this whole conversation, Casey. Our podcast is called Bosses of Knowledge, and if there's one piece of knowledge you'd like to share to our listeners, what would that be through your amazing experiences of all the different things you've gone through?
I think it's following where your passion is, because you're going to wake up energized. You're going to spend all day thinking about it. You're going to think about it in all sorts of different contexts. And not only are you going to get fulfillment and enjoyment out of it, but you're also going to do a better job at what that thing is. I guess it kind of ties to a thread that you mentioned at the start, which is the swap between the life's short, but also you've got your whole life ahead of you. And if you work on something you're passionate about, I think it hits both. You can live life now in a way that is meaningful, but it's also going to open up all sorts of incredible opportunities for you. I think one of the hard things is sometimes you don't know what your passion is. So I think that's where exploring different areas that you think you could be passionate about becomes important, but then being real with yourself that you might start exploring something and say, hey, I'm doing pretty well at this, but I'm not passionate about it. And I'd encourage those people to making sure that it's not just, sometimes you have days where you don't feel as good about something. That's a very normal thing. I even have that with my startup now, which I'm extremely passionate about. But if you're feeling over a sustained period of time that you're not vibing with the thing, then I think it's a really healthy thing to try and question what that looks like and put some attention into exploring things you are passionate about. But you'll know if you're passionate about it when you truly are passionate about it, because you just get energized about it, and it becomes vocation instead of work. You gain energy from it. There's a similar analogy that can be drawn with the difference between an introvert and an extrovert. An introvert can be incredible with people, but an introvert by definition gains energy by being with themselves, whereas an extrovert gains energy from being around others. And in that context, I would encourage people to think about a passion that they think they may have or looking at exploring is, does it give you energy? Do you get fired up about it?
What an awesome thing. Because you hear a lot of people saying follow your passion, which is just thrown about willy-nilly. But I like the way you said you've actually got to think about what your passion is. You've got to spend some time to go, hey, what actually lights my fire, and what actually puts out my fire. And that's a great way for us to end our podcast today. Casey, thanks so much for sharing your story. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure listeners will really appreciate what you shared. Thank you for being on today. I really, really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No worries. Tell listeners out there, thank you as always for being the reason why we do this. Feel free to share this, like it, and any comments, any feedback you have, feel free to say it through. As always, thank you for being part of this community, and we look forward to hearing how you fill up your boss of knowledge over the next few weeks. Thanks a lot, and bye everybody.